I'm a cancer doctor, and for me, being involved in stem cells really came out of that work, where stem cells have been used for the treatment of people with devastating blood cancers for a long time. I was thinking that maybe we could use stem cells in a different setting, and I was seeing patients at the time who had cancer because they had underlying immune deficiency, particularly had AIDS, and whether or not we could use stem cell therapies to try to rebuild their immune system was something that I was thinking about and trying to take advantage of, and so started doing work in my own lab to figure out if we couldn't do that while seeing a lot of these patients, and again, really having very few options for them at the time. Around that time, there was a recognition that in addition to maybe using blood stem cells for other kinds of approaches, other kinds of diseases, there was this recognition that, gee, maybe stem cells weren't just a peculiarity of the blood system, but were in other tissues. And then when it became possible to actually get human embryonic stem cells, that meant that stem cells could exist for every kind of tissue. So that just seemed as if what we had found as being so useful for the treatment of people with cancer could potentially be useful for the treatment of people with other diseases.
Well, HSCI started about 10 years ago, really based on a scientific discovery, which was a discovery of these special stem cells called embryonic stem cells that can make any part of the body. And even a high school student would recognize that if you have a cell that can make any part of the body, and you have people who are suffering from diseases where there are specific kinds of cells missing, you should connect those two dots. That, though, requires having some clinical work and connections to hospitals and patients. So there is no way that a basic biologist like myself could make that all happen. Fortunately for me, right here in town, was a scientist who had a similar idea, a clinician, David Skadden.
In talking with colleagues, the conversation would turn to how can we possibly leverage what we're each learning and bring it together in some unified way so we could accelerate our pace of discovery. And that was something that a couple of conversations had transpired, but none of them ever really got any traction. And then I decided to reach out to Doug Melton, who for me was this person who really functioned at a very different level, in that I was I perhaps overly characterize this as a lunch pail carrying physician, stem cell practitioner. And Doug was this very elegant developmental biologist, but I knew he was very committed to testing the use of stem cells therapeutically as well. So I thought, well, I'll just see if he's willing to have a conversation, and he was. And so I came over here to this building, actually, and met with Doug, and found Doug to be just remarkably open to the idea that together we represented two very different ends of the spectrum, but together we could also potentially fill in that gap by bringing together people, emphasizing the effort to try to accomplish something that none of us could do alone, something very distinctive, and something that in some ways we had, to some extent, a moral obligation to pursue.
And we met up and realized we had very similar ideas of the potential of these cells, and equally so, I would say, the potential of Harvard University and its affiliated hospitals to make something special happen. And with that, we were like brothers in arms and decided, okay, let's do it. So I think one of the ideas that David and I had at the time, which we still think is very important for the success of the HSCI, is that it should be focused on patients. There are a number of ways of saying that, but it should begin with a kind of patient's perspective and think about what it would be like to create an institution or a structure that had a mission-oriented goal. The goal was to find new treatments or cures for a disease. Now that might seem like an obvious thing to do, but in practice, if you're a patient with a disease, it may not be quite clear to you whether pharmaceutical companies are really thinking all the time about curing your disease. Hospitals in general are really focused on trying to care for patients rather than find cures. And universities and research institutes are doing important basic science, but again, they aren't so mission or goal oriented. So if you like, David and I dreamed that what we would do would be create a consortium of people who would reverse engineer, as it were, how to cure a disease from a patient's perspective. And if there were a kind of secret sauce to it, I would say that that has to do with the way we distribute funds, which is kind of like on a venture capitalist model. We are enormously fortunate to have significant funds from philanthropists. We then have a team of people called the executive committee that look for the best ideas, principally from younger people, and fund those in a number of ways, through program grants, kind of community grants for junior faculty, through seed grants, and then through disease programs. But the secret there is that it's focused on the outcome, the goal, which, as I've said, is not just publishing a paper or not just getting a grant, but it's to get a work product that makes a difference to patients.